All right, we are live. It is all right, we're back and we're live. Sorry, we had our technical difficulty. Welcome back, committee. Good to see you. It seems like it's been 5 days or so. We are going to start our day with the folks who are up on the screen from Dartmouth. And they had reached out, Professor Schroeder had reached out to me last fall looking for, much like the UVM program, they have public policy class or what have you. Professor Schroeder will describe what the class is, but they had reached out looking for work, something to that we were working on that they would like to study. And so at the time last fall, I was like, oh, let's, I handed them the idea of the minimum wage and overtime exemptions. And then so they've been working on this for probably 3 or 4 months now. And they have a report to share with us, which is online as well. Their material that they prepared for us is online. Later on this morning, we shifted our schedule around so that we can hear the amendments on H276, the changes that were made by the Ways and Means Committee and by the Appropriations Committee. So we're going to hear from them just before the caucus of the whole. Caucus of the whole is going to be noon to 1 on the budget. And then we're going to be on the floor for what could be another long day. So it's a treat to see you for this short amount of time. And we will meet tomorrow, thank you, at 9 a.m., not at 9:15, to take up some work on H132. So those are just the housekeeping changes. So with that, welcome Dartmouth crew. We're going to go around the room here. Not everybody's here this morning, but I'm just going to introduce ourselves. I'm Representative Tom Stevens from Waterbury, Vermont.
Representative Emily Krasnow from South Burlington.
Ashley Bartley, Fairfax, Georgia.
Caleb Elder, Lincoln, Bristol, Moncton, Starksboro.
Dennis Labounty, Linden, Sutton, Newark, Sheffield, Wheelock.
Hi, I'm Representative Elizabeth Burrows. I'm from down in your neck of the woods. I represent Windsor 1, which is Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor.
I'm Mary Howard. I represent Rutland District 6.
And Robin Chestnut Tangerman, representing Rutland Bennington District. And my early childhood was Lime Center in Norwich, so love that area.
So I don't know how you, Professor Schroeder, do you want to start by introducing your class and what you have worked on with your whole class and just give us a context of what the students are going to present today? And then we'll turn the microphone over to Thomas. And is it Thomas or Tom?
Thomas.
Thomas and Noah. All right. So welcome everybody.
Great, thanks. I wasn't actually planning on speaking, but I was mainly here to observe the students. But yeah, basically the Policy Research Shop is an opportunity for undergraduates to do real world research. We've been doing this a very long time. I won't name any other schools who have recently started imitating us. But yeah, we do this every year and we're always looking for interesting projects. We talked to the legislatures of both Vermont and New Hampshire. We also work with some local entities. Anyway, I'm just the mentor, so I really didn't want to speak any longer than that.
That's great. Thank you, Professor. And it's just as I made clear to the class, to the folks that I talked to, that at the time I didn't know what we were looking at in terms of labor bills or minimum wage bills, but from our perspective, and just for your information, folks, many of the folks here on the committee were not on the committee last year, so part of this is to help us all as a committee understand as we move forward. We have some minimum wage bills that may or may not get taken up this year, but to have this background is really helpful, because in my experience with the minimum wage law, it's like a lot of law, it's tricky. And so I appreciate you taking the time to study it. So who's going first? Take it away.
That would be me. So good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Thomas Lane, and I'm a student researcher at the Dartmouth Rockefeller Center's Policy Research Shop. I'm a current junior, originally from Minnesota, and I'll let Noah introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Noah Durham. I'm a sophomore here at Dartmouth, also a student researcher for the Policy Research Shop, originally from Wilmington, North Carolina.
Unfortunately, our colleague, Dylan Griffith, couldn't be here to testify. He started work down in DC, so he is busy today.
It's a valid excuse.
Yeah, that's what we thought too. And as you know, our professor, Daniel Schroeder, is also here today. So the Policy Research Shop is a nonpartisan organization that seeks to aid the New Hampshire and Vermont state legislatures with policy research and analysis on topics you folks request of us. We were tasked by your chair with looking into the origins of Vermont's minimum wage and overtime exemptions, which we understand are of interest to you all. He asked us to pay special attention to possible discriminatory intent behind any of these exemptions, in addition to giving you a general overview of the law's origins. What we present to you today will be an overview of our full findings, which are contained in our report, which should have been made available to you. The scope of our inquiry was that we first determined the current extent and practical impact of both federal and Vermont minimum wage and overtime exemptions, which is contained in 2 charts in our report. Next, we utilized the Green Book and a few other sources to determine when Vermont's exemptions were passed. And after we found that pretty much all of the exemptions came out of the 2 original bills creating the Vermont minimum wage and then the overtime pay requirement, we analyzed the legislative committee records on those 2 bills. Finally, we utilized a news database, newspapers.com, to look at Vermont newspaper coverage on the 2 bills to see what the press was saying about them. I will lay out what we found about the minimum wage bill, which is from 1957, and Noah will cover the 1967 overtime pay bill. Because of our organization's nonpartisan status, we felt we couldn't issue a finding of whether there was discriminatory intent at play in the original bills. Therefore, we present to you the evidence we found and leave making that conclusion to you. So the minimum wage bill was introduced by Republican Senator John Boylan, who was a quite influential lawmaker in his era and was famous enough to get a New York Times obituary when he passed away that noted his particular influence over the Vermont state budget during his tenure. The record indicates that he wrote the original bill after reviewing material from 33 other states' minimum wage laws, and that he felt it was necessary it was a necessary change to protect low-income individuals in Vermont. He was supported chiefly by organized labor. The minimum wage at the time was a bipartisan priority, and the partisan debate being not over whether there should be a minimum wage, but rather whether it should be $1 or $1.25. Senator Boylan made clear he didn't intend the bill to be a hardship to businesses. Nonetheless, numerous business owners or their representatives came out to testify against the bill or to demand changes or exemptions for their particular industries. Unfortunately, the records from 1957 are not transcripts, but rather handwritten notes taken by a committee staffer and do not contain everything that was said in the hearings. So what follows is therefore somewhat limited. The chief complaint was that business owners thought the minimum wage would put them out of business. Many feared that the bill was just a first step towards a rapid increase in wages that would rise faster than the cost of living and therefore be extreme in their opinion. Others saw it as a plot to increase the political and economic power of unions. These individuals were especially worried about a board the bill would create to oversee the minimum wage, which they feared would inevitably be run by folks from organized labor and be biased against businesses. They were also afraid that the committee would abuse its power to investigate them for violations of the law and harass, or as they phrased it, snoop on them. Another complaint was that some felt the bill wouldn't allow employers to pay workers according to the value of their labor. They were particularly concerned about their ability to hire seasonal workers. They noted in particular seasonal workers who were older and according to them, didn't fill particularly productive roles. They argued a minimum wage would force them to let these workers go. They additionally feared that the minimum wage would lead to wage compression, where new workers would have to be paid the same rate as older, more experienced workers. This would lead to either strife in the workplace or demands from the older workers for raises of their own, which would be costly to employers. In addition to organized labor, the bill was also supported by a dean from Middlebury College, who stated that it would benefit Vermont's economy. There are only two direct references to discrimination in the record. One then former legislator testified that he saw, and I'm quoting from the record here, discrimination in every section, although no context is given as to why he thought that or what he saw as discriminatory. He had previously testified that he opposed the bill because it would supposedly give the government a limitless mandate to interfere in business affairs. The second reference came from a union representative who noted that he felt the exemptions were wrong because employers, and I'm quoting from his submitted written testimony here, are ignoring the principles of human morality, either by discrimination or exploitation, because they know they are exempted from the wage and hour law as outlined in the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act is the federal law that governs these matters. No further context was given that might clarify his beliefs. So that's unfortunately all that we have on what he thought. The record contained a few other statements that might be interpreted as discriminatory. All came from opponents of the bill. One claimed that men should be excluded from the minimum wage because, in his opinion, they did not need legal protection and were excluded in other states' laws. Another statement from a business owner comes to the opposite conclusion, claiming wives and students are the ones who do not need a minimum wage. They claim they should be able to pay these workers less because both students and wives are dependents that are supported supposedly by the men and their families. Another statement on the topic of student claims that if they are given a minimum wage, will lead to non-student workers demanding raises so they stay at a higher wage than students. A final testifier claimed that the bill was unnecessary because they argue no workers in Vermont are being exploited and that those who want the minimum wage are both un-American and paternalistic. That one was a little bit of a doozy to read. The newspaper coverage from 1957 added some useful context, a little bit. First, it noted that the hotel industry felt the bill was discriminatory against them in favor of motels because it contained an exemption for businesses with fewer than 4 employees. They claimed this would have exempted many motels from the minimum wage, but not many hotels. One senator was noted in the record as having referred to this in the Senate as discrimination and that he unsuccessfully tried to amend the bill to remove this supposed discrimination. We are uncertain if this is potentially related to the references of discrimination in the record. Our best guess is that if it is, it would be related to the first reference to discrimination by the then former legislator, but not by that made by the union representative. I'm now going to pass it on to Noah to discuss our findings on the 1967 overtime pay bill.
Thank you, Thomas. In 1967, the Vermont legislature again took up the issue of minimum wage law and approved an increase to $1.40 in Senate Bill 1012. However, in the same legislation, the legislature established a framework for mandatory overtime pay, or time and a half pay for hours worked over 40, which persists to this day. However, as you all are aware, several exemptions to this requirement were added and include exemptions for people employed on farms and hotels or motels, seasonal amusement parks and recreational facilities, retail and service industries, local governments, the healthcare sector, the transportation industry, and of course, professional or salaried employees. For this research, we evaluated files from the Senate General Committee and House Committee on General and Military Affairs from this period, which included committee transcripts, records of hearings, as well as constituent letters preserved in the record. The bill's main sponsor, Senator Delaney, rarely testified on the record, so it's impossible to know exactly why certain provisions were promulgated or thought of by the author, but we can offer context and some of the arguments that members and industry representatives were making in support of some of the exemptions. Regarding the retail and service industries, for example, there seemed to be significant concern that broad overtime requirements would harm smaller businesses. The committee heard testimony about the significantly higher overhead costs for small retail grocers, and apparently there was also already concern about retail and grocery store consolidation in Vermont, with people noting a 14% decrease in the number of food stores throughout the state between 1958 and 1963, according to the US Census Bureau. This disproportionately impacted more rural areas of the state, threatening food access. There was some advocacy for an amendment exempting just retailers with under $250,000 in business operations from these overtime requirements, but there was commentary that writing legislation that way would be, quote, hard. Ultimately, a broad exemption for retailers not specifying business size was adopted in the final text. For seasonal amusement park and recreational establishments, the committee heard testimony from representatives of camping and skiing industries who commented that while minimum wage requirements were not a concern, overtime requirements would fundamentally change their business models, stunting growth and, especially with the camping industry, making these businesses unprofitable. Perhaps this explains why seasonal industries ultimately received an exemption from overtime requirements in a subsequent amendment, while not receiving an exemption from minimum wage requirements. There was also considerable testimony about the possible effect of broad overtime requirements on the hotel and motel sector, as well as on the restaurant industry. Borden Avery, a representative of the Hotel and Motel Association, testified that the overtime requirement represented a, quote, real ball of fire. Essentially, as people claimed, these industries paid out 40% or more of gross income and wages, and any provision to mandate increased overtime wages would harm the industry, already, quote, not a prosperous one. Several members also noted that many restaurant workers also received tips to supplement their wages, and ultimately a broad overtime exemption for workers in hotels, motels, and restaurants would appear in the final Senate bill. For hospitals and other health agencies, a letter from the Vermont Hospital Association to the committee argued that hospitals should not be in the same category as other employees for a couple of reasons. First, it's an operation that's open 7 days a week, day and night. Second, the availability of qualified personnel for those facilities was always a problem. And additionally, several witnesses noted that many hospital employees, such as nurses, typically followed a, quote, 8 and 80 working plan, whereby individuals would work 8 hours a day for a period of 10 days before a break of 4 days off. An atypical distribution, which would, under the proposed framework for overtime pay, require overtime pay in that circumstance. Richard Young of the Vermont Hospital Association and a Mr. Taplin of St. Johnsbury testified that they were concerned about the time and a half provision in the bill for that specific region and urged an amendment which would exclude hospitals. This would ultimately appear in the final bill as well. When the bill was referred to the House Committee on March 14th, the final text for the most part remained unchanged. However, there was testimony from Bob Fitzgerald, who is executive manager of the Vermont Truck and Bus Association, and a Mr. Wadhams, who is treasurer of the Lake Champlain Transportation Company of Burlington, on March 29th, where they advocated an additional overtime exemption for certain employees in the transportation sector who are not covered by federal law. It's important to note, however, that not all of the overtime provisions that appeared in the final bill and which still persist to this day appear to have a specific rationale stated in the records. For example, the exemption for employees of public supported nonprofits was mentioned in Senate testimony, but not really described any further. Additionally, there appeared to be no one from the farming industry who testified before either the House or Senate committee, even though an overtime exemption for agricultural workers was adopted nonetheless. However, since exemptions incorporating all of the industries that had individuals testifying ultimately appeared in the final text of the bill, it is safe to assume at least a correlation between the content of their testimony and the legislative intent behind these exemptions. And with that, we welcome any questions.
Well, thank you, first of all. Second, if you have electronic text of what your verbal presentation is beyond the report, we would appreciate those, because I think they add some color to the report. But, and I gotta say, not much has changed. You're relaying testimony and attitudes and opinions that I feel like we've heard in the last 10 years about. Did that strike you at all when you were doing the research? I don't know what you're, in terms of one, again, it wouldn't have to be minimum wage, but one side against another. Did that research, you were reading the reasons why one supported or didn't support the minimum wage, did it strike you as being right out of today's headlines?
I mean, I've followed some sorts of these debates in the news, and in some ways, yeah, it did seem like, well, that could have been written today. But obviously, there were a few things that I would have thought, well, that's definitely not from today.
Yeah.
There's a particular complaint, I think, about movie theaters, which was very interesting because they were saying back then that movie theaters were struggling because TV was coming out. Which obviously movie theaters are still around, but now they have new reasons that they're struggling.
Yeah. Oh, at one point there was and I think there still is an exemption about bat boys, or people who were working on baseball games. We could only tie it into minor league baseball up in Burlington, but the idea that if you were 13, you could be a bat boy, but you could only work till 9 p.m. or something like that. And what you mentioned that you got access to the records, notes and whatnot from those time periods. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How you managed to get that?
Oh, they're on microfilm at the state archives. So we just drove up there, and the state archivists were kind enough to help us find that.
Great. Questions for Noah or Thomas? Representative Krasna?
Not a question, but just, I'm really, really grateful that was really a wonderful presentation, and thank you for all your research. And I'm sure I speak for all of us. If you ever want to join us in person, we welcome you all, and thank you so much.
Representative LaBounty.
Yes, just to piggyback on that, I'm just going through your research and the document you sent, and it's got a lot of great information in there, and shows that you really did your homework. And I really appreciate you sending us to this, because I haven't got the time to make this second, but I will be going over through that because it's an interesting reading. I've been in the union since 1978, so some of this stuff is very familiar to me. But it's very interesting to see that folks like yourself being involved in something like this, and the research that you did speaks volumes of it. So thank you.
Representative Burrows.
Thank you. I do have a question, actually. So you looked at these two disparate times, 1957 and 1967, and I wondered whether you researched or thought at all about the relationship between the two things. What was the progression between 1957 and the kind of institution of minimum wage, and how that led to 1967? Did you look at that at all?
I mean, the most obvious shift was just that the committee records got better and easier to read. The 57 ones were handwritten, whereas the 67 ones were very conveniently typed.
Did you look at any of the years in between?
Well, no, there wasn't really any material related to the exemptions in those years. It was kind of just the original bills. Between them, they would do some stuff to raise the minimum wage, but that wasn't particularly relevant to what we were looking for.
I did see in 1967 that there was still some lingering conflict about whether or not, with minimum wage specifically, students should be exempted. So, I would say conservatively about like a third of the committee records related to that idea, because somebody was originally proposing to take out the student exemption, which ultimately did not happen. So there was still, I guess, some conflict around some of the original provisions within the minimum wage law.
Interesting, thank you.
I'll add that the student exemption does still exist in current law.
Sure does, and we've had many conversations about it over the last 10 years as well, because some people, on one hand, people think that the minimum wage is for first jobs only, and statistics show something completely different. But yes, as it stands right now, you could actually be a student under the age of 18, and someone could actually employ you for the first 60 days for like $4.25 an hour, and then move you up to $7.25 an hour. I'm not sure who would work for that or where, but that's what the law says. Representative Chestnut Tangeman.
Thank you for this report, and I'm curious when you said outlined the initial debate is between employers and organized labor. I realized I had an assumption that there wasn't a lot of organized labor in Vermont in 1957. Probably untrue, because Springfield was such a heavy manufacturing area at the time. But just, showing for me my own biases and assumptions. But I'm wondering if you followed the flow of organized labor in Vermont between 57 and 67, whether there were more union members, fewer union members. I mean, I know union membership nationally is at a low point. I'm just wondering if that came up at all in your research.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that at this time. If you want me to look into that, I can do that, but I don't have any numbers for you.
Any number of rabbit holes you could go down and something like this, and that's just one of them. Yeah.
There was a bill that was being deliberated in 1967 that was separate from the bill that I was talking about. It looked like it had, significant relationship with the idea of like organized labor and just provisions around that, but that wasn't in the scope of our project, so did not look into that, but would be willing to look into it further if that would be helpful.
I'm also just curious that as we've talked about, minimum wage in so many ways hasn't changed, or the same debates, the same arguments, and now we have a minimum wage that has a regular adder. It increases every year, and it's still not keeping up. And I'm wondering, although I know your intention is to be nonpartisan, I wonder if you drew conclusions about the effectiveness of minimum wage and exemptions. Or is that putting you, is that trying to draw you into partisan debate and you want to avoid that?
I mean, what I will say is that it definitely, because you have an automatic increase, it definitely helps you guys avoid some of the acrimony surrounding the original, having to change it every so often. So there's that benefit to you folks. I mean, I guess the best way to answer your question would be to look at, how many people are actually getting paid the minimum wage compared to how many people make more than that. Because then you can say, well, if there's a lot of people clustered at just the minimum wage, you might be able to say, well, okay, well, without the minimum wage, then a lot of them might be making even less. I guess the unfortunate part of that is we didn't have access to any data that would tell us that number. So I can't reach any conclusion there, but that's how I would find it if that data does become available.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I was struck by your comment, by your reporting of the comments from someone who testified that, you know, we have a lot of older people who work and, you know, we'd have to lay them off if the wages went up, and that just is kind of a clear, it's not an echo. I mean, it's I guess, well, when we hear it now, it's an echo of that conversation, you know, that even the minimum wage is expensive for folks. Okay, we're talking about your nonpartisanship. I do appreciate the fact that you laid out clearly that when it came to determining if something was discriminatory, that you took a step back and you provided facts without making opinionated or expressing an opinion about whether they were discriminatory or not. And I find that a very solid boundary. So thank you for adhering to it, but also frustrating because I wanna, you know, can data, it raises the question to me, can data show discrimination? You know, and you rightfully, for where you are, you made it irrelevant. You made that question irrelevant, and you're just presenting the information. I just, what kind of bridles or shackles did you have to put on yourself to not have an opinion, to keep to that boundary? Was that difficult when you were doing the work?
I mean, most of the record was not related to, frankly, the exemptions. And even less of it was related to, you know, things that might be discriminatory, the handful of quotes that we were able to give to you. So no, I wouldn't say that I felt that we were limited in you know, what we did. Yeah.
There was definitely, you know, I guess probably a lot more discussion about some of the exemptions in the 1967 files as opposed to the 1957 files, since they were transcribed. With respect to discrimination, though, there were barely any mentions directly of that in the record. So I guess it wasn't hard to, you know, figure out how to characterize that in the report. But I will say one of the things that was a little bit frustrating for me was that since we only have testimony relating to, like, you know, what the committee members were talking about on the record, or what, you know, different industry representatives were talking about in testimony, we don't know the type of, like, backdoor deliberations that were happening, or even the original motivation for why Senator Delaney authored some of the bill in the way that he did. So there is a fundamental, you know, gray area there, as opposed to, you know, there's some things about this bill that we will just never be able to know for certainty.
Nor us. Representative Chestnut Tangerman.
So just thinking, comment that Thomas made about where the data of where income clusters, if it clusters at minimum wage, we would know that minimum wage, the legislation is driving that, affecting that. And I was thinking, as I recall, New Hampshire doesn't have a state minimum wage, it's just federal, right? It's $7.25. I can't imagine anybody in New Hampshire earns $7.25 an hour. So I'm really curious how that tracks with, you know, what are the clusters in New Hampshire, the wage level clusters, what they're driven by. I think that would be an interesting, I'm not asking you to pursue that, but I think it would be an interesting study.
Well, when we drive.
Oh, sorry. Just quickly, it's definitely an interesting question. Even if you drive over to, like, West Lebanon and you look at, like, the McDonald's, they're, like, hiring for, like, $16.25 an hour or something like that. So certainly, like, a lot of what we would normally consider to be minimum wage jobs are paying, in that case, you know, more than double what the minimum wage is here.
That was exactly what I was going to say from our side of the border. You know, we could drive over and see that happening. And needless to say, the border wars of sorts between New Hampshire and Vermont about who taxes more and who has, you know, I mean, there's so many questions that happen at that level that I think they just even themselves out, where we forget that you might want to you might get a part-time job at King Arthur Flour just across the bridge and, for more than what you can make in New Hampshire and still live in New Hampshire, and so, anyway, any further questions for these folks?
Yeah.
I would really like to thank you for your time and for your time and your work on this. This was well done, and I look forward to reading the full report. And I really appreciate you spending time in the Dusty Archives. I mean, this is I'm not sure I have a clear idea of how the New Hampshire state legislature works, but I know that for us to do this kind of research, it's virtually impossible for us to take the time individually. We don't have the kind of staff that can do this kind of research. So I appreciate you actually, putting your nose to it and getting it done. And Professor Schroeder, thank you for kind of hounding me throughout the summer and having me make a decision on this. It's really good to have this as a piece of background information. And if we do, I can't promise, but I could certainly envision quoting some of this material on the floor if we ever have to redo the minimum wage, because certainly, again, the parallels between 1957 and 2023 are pretty, they're pretty good when it comes to these kinds of conversations, and it just shows me that it's not a lack of progress, it's just that people have different thoughts and different worldviews on how people should be compensated, and this really shows how deep that goes, at least back to 1957. So thank you so much for putting it together for it and for visiting with us today.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for the opportunity to do the research, and especially the opportunity to present our findings. And just for future reference, we do this every year. We're always looking for interesting problems for our students to work on. Typically, we start late summer, early fall looking for projects to present in the early spring, but we can do other timelines as well, and with or without an underlying bill to study. So thank you.
And if you're in the vicinity, as Representative Krasno said, please stop by. We're in room 31. It says education on the door, but it's not the education committee. But if you want to come up and visit and see what we're doing while we're in session, we'd be glad to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we can go off live. Let's take 15 minutes before we get